Oh, physically grotesque that no woman would ever share his bed again. For 5 years after executing his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, in 1542, the king, who once had mistresses lining up at his chamber doors, died completely alone. Historians have whispered about his final years for centuries, but the medical records they've tried to bury reveal a horror beyond imagination. This isn't about romance or scandal. This is about flesh rotting off bone. This is about a king who smelled like death from 3 rooms away. This is about wounds that never healed, a body that ballooned to over 300 pounds, and legs so infected that servants gagged while carrying him. Listen, I pour everything into researching these dark histories that textbooks refuse to tell you. If you're tired of sanitized history, and you want the raw, disturbing truth that's been hidden for centuries, then subscribe right now. Because I promise you, what you're about to hear in this video will change how you see royal history forever. They buried this story for a reason. Let's uncover it together. February 10th, 1542. The royal barge cuts through the Thames like a blade through silk, carrying a teenage girl toward her death. Catherine Howard, once Queen of England, sits motionless as the vessel glides beneath London Bridge. She cannot help but look up. There, rotting on iron spikes against the grey winter sky, are the severed heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham. The men she loved, the men who loved her. Their dead eyes stare at nothing while ravens pick at their decomposing flesh. Catherine turns away, but the image burns into her mind. In 3 days, her own head will join theirs. The Tower of London swallows her through Traitor's Gate, the same entrance that consumed her cousin Anne Boleyn 6 years earlier. The same cold stones, the same damp air, thick with centuries of fear. Catherine is 17 years old, maybe 18. Nobody knows for certain. What they do know is that she will not live to see 19. The night of February 12th stretches impossibly long. Tomorrow is Sunday. They cannot execute a queen on the Sabbath. So Catherine waits. And in that waiting, something breaks inside her. The guards hear strange sounds coming from her chamber. Scraping, thuds, whispered counting. When they peer through the door, they witness something that will haunt them forever. The young queen is practicing, on her knees, over and over, laying her neck across a wooden chest, adjusting the angle, repositioning her hands. She is terrified the executioner will miss, terrified the blade will hack into her shoulder, her spine, her jaw, terrified she will scream and thrash while the crowd watches, so she rehearses her own death like an actress preparing for opening night. February 13th, 7 o'clock in the morning. The executioner sharpens his axe while Catherine dresses in black velvet. Her hands shake so violently that her ladies must fasten the gown for her. When the guards arrive, her legs buckle. They have to support her weight as they half carry, half drag her across Tower Green, the same patch of earth where Anne Boleyn bled, where the grass still grows darker in one particular spot. A small crowd has gathered. Nobles, witnesses required by law. Their breath mists in the freezing air as Catherine is helped onto the scaffold. She is so weak she can barely stand, but somehow she finds her voice. The words come out fractured, barely audible. She admits her guilt. She says her sentence is just. She asks them to pray for the king, Henry, the man who ordered this. Henry, who is not here to watch what he has done. Then Catherine kneels. She lays her neck across the block, just as she practiced. Her rehearsal was perfect. The executioner raises the axe. One moment, Catherine Howard is alive, trembling, breathing. The next moment, she is not. One clean strike. The head separates. Blood pools across the scaffold in dark crimson rivers. Before they can even remove her body, Lady Jane Rochford is brought forward. She kneels in Catherine's still warm blood. Before Catherine Howard's blood soaked into Tower Green, Henry VIII was a different creature entirely. Not just physically, but in appetite. For 3 decades, the king moved through women like a wolf through a flock. Marriage vows meant nothing. Fidelity was a concept for commoners. If Henry desired a woman, he took her. And there were always women. Bessie Blount was barely 15 when the king first noticed her dancing at court. Within months, she warmed his bed, while his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, prayed alone in cold chambers. Bessie gave Henry what Catherine could not: a healthy son. Illegitimate, yes, but proof that the king's seed could produce male heirs. When Henry tired of Bessie, she vanished to a convent. Her reward for bearing a royal bastard: silence and stone walls. Then came Mary Boleyn. Sweet, compliant Mary. She pleased the king for years before he grew bored with her softness. But Mary had a sister, Anne. Dark-eyed, sharp-tongued Anne, who refused to become just another royal mistress. She demanded marriage or nothing. Henry tore England from Rome to have her. He destroyed centuries of religious tradition. He beheaded his Lord Chancellor. He risked civil war, all for Anne Boleyn's bed. But even Anne could not hold him. Before her coronation crown had gathered dust, Henry's eyes wandered to Jane Seymour. Pale, submissive Jane, who watched Anne's power crumble with quiet satisfaction. Henry took Jane as a mistress, while Anne still wore the Queen's jewels. The pattern was clear. Henry desired, Henry took, Henry discarded. The cycle repeated endlessly. Court ladies learned to read the king's moods. When his gaze lingered too long, some felt thrilled at the prospect of royal favor. Others felt dread, because becoming Henry's lover meant entering a game you could not win. Stay too long, and you became an inconvenience. Resist, and you became an enemy. The smart ones accepted his attentions, extracted what wealth and position they could, then faded into strategic marriages when he moved on. His lords knew to keep their daughters away when the king visited. Fathers who valued their family's virtue made sure their wives and daughters were conveniently absent during royal hunts. But ambitious fathers did the opposite. They perfumed and dressed their daughters like prizes, pushing them into Henry's path, hoping for royal bastards that might elevate their bloodlines. Hampton Court Palace hummed with whispers. Everyone knew when Henry took a new favorite. The woman would suddenly appear in finer gowns. She would sit closer to the Queen at banquets. Musicians would play beneath her window at night. And the Queen, whichever wife currently wore the crown, would grow quieter, paler, more desperate. This was the man who executed Catherine Howard, a man whose entire adult life was defined by insatiable hunger, who collected women like trophies and displayed them like artwork before tossing them aside, who rewrote the laws of God and England when one woman denied him. So when that man suddenly stopped, when Henry's bedchamber remained empty for years after Catherine's death, when no mistresses emerged, no favorites, no late-night visits, no whispers, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Henry VIII learned of Catherine's death while hunting at Hampton Court. Witnesses recorded that he showed no emotion, no tears, no rage, nothing. He simply nodded, turned his horse, and rode deeper into the forest alone. For hours, no one knew where he was. His guards searched frantically, terrified the king might harm himself, or worse, that enemies might find him vulnerable. When Henry finally returned at dusk, his face was blank, empty, as if something essential had been carved out and discarded. But that emptiness did not last. Within days, courtiers noticed the transformation. Henry's temper, always volatile, became genuinely dangerous. He would explode over trivial matters. A servant bringing wine too slowly. A musician hitting a wrong note. A dog barking during dinner. His fury was immediate and total. Men who had served him for decades found themselves banished over imagined slights. The atmosphere at court shifted from cautious to terrified. Thomas Wriothesley, one of Henry's most trusted counselors, made the mistake of mentioning Catherine's name in conversation. Henry's face turned purple. He seized a nearby candlestick and hurled it across the room, missing Wriothesley's head by inches. The king bellowed that her name was never to be spoken again. She was to be erased, forgotten, as if she had never existed. Guards were stationed outside the royal chambers with explicit orders. Anyone who uttered that name would face the tower. The nobles began whispering among themselves, not about Catherine, about Henry. Because something was visibly wrong with the king beyond his grief and rage. His appearance was deteriorating at an alarming rate. When Catherine was alive just months earlier, Henry was large but still mobile. Now he moved differently, slower, with obvious pain. His face had grown moon-like, bloated beyond recognition. His neck seemed to disappear into his shoulders. The French ambassador wrote detailed reports back to his king. He described Henry's legs, which were wrapped in bandages that needed changing multiple times daily. He mentioned an odor that clung to the king. Not perfume or sweat, but something else. Something organic and wrong. The ambassador noted that Henry could no longer climb stairs without assistance. That servants had installed ramps and special chairs throughout the palace. Court ladies who once jostled for position near the king now found reasons to keep their distance. Not from fear of his temper alone, but from something more primal. Revulsion. The man who had once embodied masculine power and sexual magnetism was transforming into something monstrous. His beauty was melting away like wax near flame. The most disturbing change was the silence. Hampton Court had always been alive with music, laughter, dancing, flirtation. Now the hallways echoed with footsteps and whispered prayers. The king's presence cast a shadow that chilled every room he entered. Servants avoided eye contact. Musicians played quietly, terrified of drawing attention. And everyone noticed the same impossible thing. For the first time in 30 years, there were no women. No favorites, no late-night visits, no secret glances or knowing smiles. Henry's bedchamber remained empty, except for his physicians. The beast that had consumed women like fuel had suddenly stopped feeding. They thought it was grief. They were wrong. It was something far worse. 16 months. From February 1542, when Catherine's head rolled, to July 1543, when Henry married Catherine Parr. 500 days. For a man whose entire reign had been defined by his inability to stay faithful, by his constant hunt for new flesh, 16 months without a single mistress was impossible. Unthinkable. Yet it happened. The court chroniclers recorded every royal feast, every hunt, every diplomatic meeting. Not once in those 500 days did they note a new favorite. No mysterious lady receiving sudden gifts. No servants carrying secret letters. No musicians playing beneath unfamiliar windows. The machinery of royal adultery, so well-oiled for 3 decades, had ground to a complete halt. The Spanish ambassador wrote urgent dispatches trying to explain this phenomenon to his king. He theorized that grief had finally broken Henry's spirit. That watching another wife die had shattered something fundamental. But then the ambassador attended a council meeting and sat downwind of the king. His next letter told a different story. This was not grief. This was decay. Henry's physicians kept detailed records, now locked away in royal archives. In March of 1542, just 1 month after Catherine's execution, they recorded that both of the king's leg ulcers had become severely infected simultaneously. The wounds, which had been manageable for years, suddenly erupted. Pus flowed in quantities that soaked through multiple layers of bandages. The stench became so overwhelming that servants began burning incense constantly in the king's presence. It made no difference. By summer, Henry could no longer mount a horse without a specially constructed ramp and 4 men pushing from behind. The royal hunts, once showcases of masculine prowess, where Henry would seduce ladies among the trees, became humiliating spectacles. The king sat motionless on a sweating horse, while beaters drove deer directly into his line of fire. He could barely pull the bowstring. When he did manage to loose an arrow, it rarely flew true. His hands shook. His vision was failing. The ladies of the court noticed something else. Something they only whispered about in the safety of their private chambers. When Henry walked past, when his enormous shadow fell across them, there was no longer any heat in his gaze. No predatory hunger. His eyes were dull, exhausted. The fire that had burned through so many women had simply extinguished. They felt relief. And underneath that relief, a creeping horror at what he had become. Foreign princes seeking alliances began offering their daughters as potential brides. Henry's counselors brought him miniature portraits of beautiful young women from across Europe. Princesses, duchesses, any of whom would have been honored to become Queen of England. Henry barely glanced at the paintings. He had no interest, no capacity for interest. His body was consuming all his energy just trying to stay alive. The impossible had happened. Henry VIII, the wolf who had devoured women for 30 years, had become something that no woman would willingly approach. Not from moral virtue, not from religious conviction, but from pure physical impossibility. The question was no longer why Henry had no mistresses. The question was how any woman could be convinced to marry what he had become. January 24th, 1536, Greenwich Palace. The jousting tournament should never have happened. Henry was 44 years old, past his prime, carrying extra weight from years of feasting. But the king insisted. He needed to prove he was still the warrior who had once dominated every tournament field in England. So they prepared the horses. They sharpened the lances. They prayed it would not end badly. It ended catastrophically. Henry thundered down the tilt-yard on a massive warhorse bred specifically to carry his increasing bulk. His opponent, a younger knight whose name history has mercifully forgotten, charged from the opposite end. The lances should have glanced off armor. They should have splintered harmlessly. Instead, Henry's horse stumbled. Some witnesses said it slipped on mud. Others claimed the animal simply collapsed under the king's weight. The reason did not matter. What mattered was the physics of disaster. A fully armored Henry VIII weighed approximately 340 pounds. His warhorse weighed over 1,400 pounds. When the animal went down, the king had no time to react. The horse rolled. Henry was trapped beneath it. Metal scraped against metal. Bones cracked like dry wood snapping. The sound echoed across the tournament grounds. Then silence. Horrible, absolute silence. Henry did not move, did not breathe. The horse thrashed, its own legs broken, crushing the king further into the frozen ground. Guards and nobles sprinted onto the field, screaming for help. It took 8 men to lift the dying horse off Henry's body. Underneath, the king lay motionless. His eyes were open, but seeing nothing. Blood seeped from beneath his helmet. For 2 hours, Henry VIII was unconscious. His physicians clustered around him, debating whether he was already dead. They removed his armor piece by agonizing piece, revealing the damage underneath. His left leg was shattered. Bone fragments pressed against the skin that had turned purple and black. His right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. But the worst injury was invisible. The king's brain, slammed inside his skull like a bell struck too hard, had begun to swell. When Henry finally woke, he was different. Not immediately. The changes came gradually over months. His temper, always volatile, became psychotic. His memory grew unreliable. He would forget conversations from hours earlier, then fly into rages when courtiers could not explain what he had forgotten. The jovial king who wrote poetry and composed music became a paranoid tyrant who saw traitors in every shadow. But the physical damage was permanent and progressive. The leg wounds refused to heal properly. They closed, then reopened. Closed again, then festered. Within months, the ulcers had established themselves. Open sores that would drain pus and blood for the remaining 11 years of Henry's life. The accident did not just injure the king. It began his transformation into something monstrous. And on that frozen January day in 1536, the countdown to Catherine Howard's execution and to Henry's final loveless years had already begun. The wounds never closed. Not properly, not permanently. From 1536 onward, Henry's legs became prison cells of flesh, trapping infection inside while simultaneously refusing to seal. Modern doctors would recognize the condition immediately. Chronic venous ulcers complicated by repeated trauma and poor circulation. But in the 16th century, physicians had no framework to understand what was happening. They only knew that the king was rotting from the legs upward. The ulcers appeared as dark craters in Henry's calves, each roughly the size of a fist. The edges were raised and inflamed, angry red tissue that wept constantly. But the centers were worse. Blackened tissue, necrotic flesh that had died but refused to slough away naturally. Beneath the dead skin, the wounds tunneled deeper, into muscle, toward bone, creating pockets where bacteria bred in warm, oxygen-starved darkness. Henry's physicians faced an impossible dilemma. If they allowed the ulcers to close completely, the infection would turn inward. Sepsis would flood his bloodstream and kill him within days. But keeping the wounds open meant perpetual agony and increasing disability. They chose slow death over fast. They chose torture over mercy. The treatment was barbaric, even by Tudor standards. Multiple times per week, sometimes daily during severe infections, the royal physicians would insert thin metal rods called setons deep into the ulcers. These weren't smooth medical instruments. They were textured, designed to scrape away dead tissue and keep drainage channels open. The doctor would probe the wound, feeling for pockets of pus, then push the seton through living flesh until it emerged from another part of the leg. Henry's screams during these procedures echoed through Hampton Court. Servants 3 floors away would hear the king's voice crack and break as physicians dug inside his rotting legs. They used no anesthetic, no painkiller, just wine to dull the senses slightly, which Henry consumed in increasingly dangerous quantities. The king would bite down on leather straps, his teeth grinding through the material over time, replacing them monthly with fresh ones. After each seton treatment, the physicians would pack the wounds with various compounds. Honey mixed with ground herbs, poultices made from egg whites and lead acetate, bandages soaked in wine and turpentine. Nothing worked for long. Within hours, the bandages would be saturated with yellowish-green discharge that stank of decay. Servants whose duty it was to change these dressings would vomit from the smell. Some requested transfers to other duties, willing to accept punishment rather than face the king's legs again. The worst part was the unpredictability. Sometimes an ulcer would seem to improve, the drainage slowing, the edges beginning to knit together. Henry would feel hope. Perhaps this time it would finally heal. Then, without warning, the infection would flare. The wound would burst open overnight, flooding the bedsheets with pus and blood. The pain would spike from constant to unbearable. And the cycle would begin again. By 1542, the year of Catherine Howard's execution, both legs were compromised. Henry could not walk without assistance, could not stand for long periods, could not kneel to pray, could not dance, could not ride, could not do any of the physical activities that had once defined his masculinity, and absolutely could not be intimate with anyone who valued their sense of smell. The royal armourer kept meticulous records. They had to. Each suit of plate armour was custom fitted to Henry's exact measurements, crafted over months at extraordinary expense. These records tell a story more horrifying than any chronicle. They document a king's transformation from god to grotesque and clinical, undeniable numbers. 1524. Age 33. Henry's armour shows a waist measurement of 32 inches, a chest of 42 inches, the proportions of an elite athlete. The body of a man who could joust for hours, dance until dawn, hunt from sunrise to sunset without tiring. The armour gleamed on him. He looked like a warrior saint cast in steel. 1536. Age 45. After the accident. Waist 38 inches. Chest 45 inches. Still impressive, but the trajectory had shifted. The armourer noted difficulty with the fitting. The king could no longer stand still for long measurements. His legs throbbed. He shifted weight constantly, grimacing. 1540. Age 49. Waist 44 inches. Chest 49 inches. The armour required significant reinforcement. Standard steel plates were no longer sufficient to span Henry's expanding frame. The armourer had to use thicker gauge metal, which made the suits heavier, which made wearing them more agonizing for the king's damaged legs. A vicious cycle of metal and meat. 1544. Age 53. 2 years after Catherine Howard's execution. Waist 52 inches. Chest 53 inches. The armor is less protective equipment and more engineering marvel. How do you encase a man this large in metal and still allow him to move? The answer is, you barely can. This final suit of armor was ceremonial. Henry could wear it while sitting. Walking in it was impossible. But the armor measurements only told part of the story. They captured circumference, but not texture. Not the reality of what that expanding flesh looked like, felt like. Courtiers who had known young Henry struggled to recognize the creature before them. His face had transformed into a moon of skin stretched tight over fluid-swollen tissue. His eyes, once bright and piercing, now seemed to sink into folds of flesh. His multiple chins cascaded down to merge with his shoulders. His neck had effectively disappeared. His legs became tree trunks wrapped in rotting bark. The muscle that once powered him through tournaments had converted to fat that hung in folds over his knees. But worse than the fat were the bandages. Always bandages. Layers of cloth wrapped around both calves, stained yellow and brown, giving off vapor that made people's eyes water. His arms thickened until fine motor control became difficult. He struggled to hold a quill steady enough to sign documents. His fingers looked like overstuffed sausages ready to burst their casings. Rings that once slid easily on and off became embedded in flesh that grew around them like tree bark swallowing a chain. The weight estimates vary. 300 pounds, certainly, by 1542. Some historians suggest 350. A few argue close to 400 by his death in 1547. The exact number mattered less than the reality. Henry VIII had become too large to function, too massive to move without assistance, too grotesque to inspire desire. And this was the body that no woman would ever willingly approach again. There are certain smells the human brain cannot ignore. Smoke signals danger. Decay signals death. The scent of infected tissue triggers something primal, a biological alarm that screams, "Get away from this." Henry VIII's legs produced that smell, not faintly, not occasionally, constantly, powerfully, unavoidably. The Venetian ambassador, who prided himself on diplomatic composure, broke protocol in a letter home. He described attending a council meeting where Henry entered the chamber. Before the king appeared, before his guards announced him, everyone knew he was coming. The smell arrived first, like an advance guard of rot. The ambassador wrote that it reminded him of battlefields 3 days after fighting ended, of bodies left to bloat in summer heat. He had to excuse himself twice during the meeting to vomit in the corridor. Court physicians tried everything to mask the odor. They burned frankincense and myrrh in braziers throughout the royal apartments. They scattered lavender and rose petals on floors the king would cross. They soaked his bandages in rosewater and expensive perfumes imported from Arabia. Nothing worked. The infection was too deep, too aggressive, too determined to announce itself. Within minutes of fresh bandages being applied, the stench would seep through. Servants assigned to the king's personal chambers began requesting transfers, not quietly. Some begged openly, tears streaming down their faces, willing to accept any punishment rather than spend another night breathing that air. The smell embedded itself in clothing, in hair, in the lining of the nose. One lady-in-waiting claimed she could taste it, that the rot somehow coated her tongue even when she was rooms away from the king. Henry knew. Of course he knew. People's faces betrayed them. The slight wince when he approached. The unconscious step backward. The handkerchief brought to the nose and then quickly lowered in embarrassment. He saw all of it. And something inside him, some last fragment of the young man who had once been England's most desirable bachelor, died a little more each time. The physical impossibility of romance became obvious. How could any woman embrace a man whose body announced decay from 3 rooms away? How could intimacy exist when breathing meant gagging? The closest historical comparison would be advanced gangrene, which is exactly what Henry was fighting. His legs were engaged in a permanent battle between living tissue and dead, with the dead tissue rotting in real time while still attached to his body. By 1542, staff had established protocols. When the king approached, windows would be thrown open, regardless of weather. In winter, courtiers froze rather than admit why they needed fresh air so desperately. Incense bearers walked ahead of Henry like an honor guard. their braziers smoking frantically. Musicians played loud enough to cover the sound of people retching. This was the man who ordered Catherine Howard's execution. This walking corpse, this source of pestilential air. This king, whose own body had turned against him so violently that it repelled every living thing nearby. No woman had shared his bed since her death. Now everyone understood why. The mystery wasn't why Henry had no mistresses. The mystery was how anyone could stand to be in the same room with him at all. Walking. The simplest human action. One foot in front of the other. Children master it before their second birthday. But in 1542, at age 51, Henry VIII lost this fundamental ability. Not all at once. The decline was gradual, humiliating, and absolutely terrifying for a man who had once moved through the world like a conquering god. 1540 began with a walking stick. Ornate, jewel-encrusted, carried more for show than necessity. Henry insisted he simply preferred the elegance of it. Everyone knew better. By autumn, he leaned on that stick with genuine desperation. His legs could not support his weight for more than a few minutes. Standing through a church service became impossible. Special chairs were constructed and positioned strategically so the king could sit whenever his legs began trembling. 1541 brought the wheelchair. Not the term they used, of course. They called it a walking chair, a tramway, anything but what it truly was. An admission of defeat, a mobile throne for a crippled king. It required 2 servants to push, and even then they struggled. 300 pounds of monarch plus the weight of the chair itself. The servants rotated shifts because their backs could not endure a full day of pushing Henry's bulk through palace corridors. But wheelchairs only worked on flat surfaces. Hampton Court Palace was built across multiple levels, stairs everywhere. Grand staircases designed to impress visiting dignitaries now became vertical prisons trapping the king on whichever floor he occupied. The solution was medieval and terrifying. They built a lift. Not a proper mechanical lift with pulleys and counterweights. Nothing so sophisticated. A wooden chair reinforced with iron straps. Ropes attached to all 4 corners. The chair would be positioned at the base of a staircase. Henry would lower himself into it, gripping the armrests with white-knuckled terror. Then 6 guards, 3 on each side above, would haul on the ropes. They lifted the king like cargo, like a sack of grain being hoisted into a barn loft. The chair would sway. It would spin slightly as it rose. Henry would close his eyes and pray. His fear of heights had worsened with age. The thought of falling, of his massive body tumbling down stone steps, haunted his nightmares. One rope fraying, one knot slipping, one guard losing his grip. He would crash down and shatter like dropped pottery. At his weight, with his brittle bones, he would not survive. The guards sweated and grunted. The ropes creaked. The chair rose inch by agonizing inch while Henry sat frozen, barely breathing. When they finally reached the upper landing and hauled him onto solid floor, his hands shook. Sometimes he wept with relief. The King of England, reduced to tears by a single flight of stairs. This happened multiple times daily. Every meal, every council meeting, every trip to the chapel. The servants developed shoulder injuries from the constant lifting. Physicians treated strained backs weekly. The palace carpenters reinforced the chair monthly as the ropes wore grooves into the wood. And through it all, Henry remembered. Remembered running. Remembered dancing. Remembered carrying women to bed with ease. Now he could not even carry himself. 1545. 3 years before Henry's death. The chairlift was no longer sufficient. His legs had deteriorated beyond the point where he could even stand long enough to be strapped into the hoisting chair. A new solution emerged. They called it the King's Tram. The name suggested something dignified, mechanical, modern. The reality was far more primitive and humiliating. 6 men, always 6. Fewer could not bear the weight. They were selected for strength, not noble birth. Former dock workers, blacksmiths, men whose backs and shoulders had been forged by brutal labor. They stood 3 on each side of an enclosed sedan chair reinforced with iron bands. The chair itself was a cage disguised as furniture. Thick wooden poles extended from each side like the handles of a massive coffin. Henry would be helped into this contraption each morning by his personal servants. The process took 30 minutes. Getting his ulcerated legs positioned without screaming took patience. Arranging his massive bulk so the chair's weight distributed somewhat evenly required calculation. Then the curtains would be drawn, not for privacy, for dignity. So the court would not have to watch their king being carried like cargo. The command would come. 6 men would grip the poles. Muscles would tense. A coordinated lift. The groan of wood under impossible strain. Then movement. Slow. Careful. The shuffling march of human pack animals hauling 300 pounds of monarch plus another 100 pounds of reinforced chair. Through the corridors of Hampton Court they would trudge. The guards cleared paths ahead. Servants pressed themselves against walls. Everyone pretended not to notice. Not to hear the labored breathing of the carriers. Not to see the sweat darkening their clothes even in winter. Not to acknowledge that England's king, defender of the faith, supreme head of the church, was being transported like furniture. The carriers rotated every hour. No human body could sustain that burden longer. Their shoulders developed permanent grooves where the poles rested. Their spines compressed. Physicians treated them for hernias and back injuries weekly. Some requested transfers. Most were denied. This was essential royal service. Refusing meant imprisonment. Henry knew what he had become. Behind those curtains, he wept sometimes. Other times, rage consumed him. He would scream at the carriers for moving too quickly, too slowly, for jostling him when the pain in his legs spiked. They absorbed his fury in silence. What choice did they have? Respond to a king's tantrum while carrying that king. Drop him and face execution. The physical intimacy of romantic relationship was now laughable. Henry could not walk to a bedchamber, could not climb into bed without assistance, could not support his own weight, could not move without 6 men knowing exactly where he was going. Privacy had died along with his mobility. The thought of seduction, of secret meetings, of stolen moments with a mistress belonged to a different man in a different body in a different lifetime. This was Henry's reality after Catherine Howard. Not a king on a throne, a prisoner in a chair, not a man who chose celibacy. A creature who had lost the physical capacity for intimacy even if desire remained. The wolf had become cargo. The hunter had become baggage, and everyone carried the weight of that terrible transformation. The smell of burning meat filled the royal bedchamber. Not from the kitchens, from the king's own legs. Henry lay on his bed, stripped to his undergarments, while physicians prepared their instruments. Iron rods heated in braziers until they glowed orange. This was not punishment. This was medicine. This was how you saved a king from gangrene in 1543. The logic was medieval but sound. When infection took hold too deeply in the ulcers, when pus turned green and the tissue blackened with necrosis, only fire could cleanse it. Dead flesh had to be burned away. Living tissue had to be seared closed. The alternative was blood poisoning spreading through the body until organs failed and death came mercifully quick. Henry knew the drill. He had endured this horror dozens of times. It never got easier. His physicians would administer wine mixed with poppy extract, but it barely dulled the edge of what was coming. The king would grip the bedposts so hard his knuckles turned white. Leather straps were fitted around his chest and arms to prevent him from thrashing and injuring himself. The senior physician would nod. The assistant would lift the glowing iron from the coals. Steam rose from the metal. The room went silent, except for Henry's ragged breathing. Then the iron descended toward his leg. The moment hot metal touched infected flesh, Henry screamed. A sound that was barely human. A sound that resonated through stone walls and wooden floors. Servants 3 corridors away would stop whatever they were doing. New staff would look around in horror. Veterans would simply cross themselves and continue working. This was Tuesday. This was Thursday. This was the sound of their king being saved. The physician worked quickly, pressing the cautery iron into the wound, holding it there while flesh sizzled and smoke rose. The smell was unholy. Roasting pork mixed with decay. Sweet and rotten simultaneously. Henry's screams would escalate into something beyond screaming. A sustained shriek that cracked his voice. Tears and sweat poured down his face. His body convulsed against the restraints. One also required multiple applications. The iron had to be reheated. Henry would get perhaps 30 seconds of gasping relief before the torture resumed. Some treatments required both legs to be cauterized on the same day. Those sessions lasted over an hour. By the end, Henry's voice was gone, reduced to hoarse whimpering. His bedclothes were soaked with sweat. Sometimes he lost consciousness. His physicians considered that a blessing. The aftermath was almost worse than the treatment. The burns atop the ulcers created new layers of agony. For days afterward, any movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his legs. The fresh burns would weep clear fluid, then yellow pus, as new infections inevitably took hold. Within weeks, another cauterization would be needed. The cycle was endless. This was Henry's existence after Catherine Howard. Trapped in a body that required regular torture just to stay alive. His screams became so routine that palace life adapted around them. Musicians played louder during treatment days. Courtiers scheduled meetings for other times. Everyone learned to pretend they heard nothing. What woman could desire this? What intimacy could survive in a bedchamber that regularly became a torture chamber? The answer was none. The body was dying. Everyone could see that. What terrified the court more was watching the mind follow. Henry VIII was not just decaying physically. Something inside his skull was breaking down. The man who had once debated theology with scholars and composed sophisticated music was becoming someone else. Someone dangerous. Someone unpredictable. Someone who barely resembled the prince who had ascended the throne in 1509. The mood swings came without warning or logic. One moment, Henry would be discussing agricultural policy with his counselors, voice calm, thoughts organized. Then a servant would drop a plate 3 rooms away. The sound would trigger something. Henry's face would transform, purple with rage, veins bulging in his forehead. He would scream until his voice cracked. Threaten execution for minor infractions. Courtiers learned to freeze like prey animals when these episodes struck. Movement attracted attention. Attention meant becoming a target. The paranoia was worse. Henry became convinced that everyone plotted against him. His counselors, his servants, his own children. He would wake screaming in the night, certain that assassins crept through palace corridors. Guards would burst into his chambers to find him alone, wild-eyed, pointing at shadows. Sometimes he could not recognize people he had known for years. His memory fractured. He would forget conversations from hours earlier, then accuse men of lying when they contradicted his false recollections. Modern medical historians point to Cushing's syndrome, a rare condition where the body produces too much cortisol. It explains everything. The rapid weight gain despite previous athleticism. The moon-shaped face. The slow healing wounds. The violent mood swings. The paranoia. The depression that would descend on Henry like a suffocating blanket. But Cushing's syndrome requires a trigger. Brain trauma. Like being unconscious for 2 hours under a horse in full armor. Like severe concussion that swells the brain tissue. Like damage to the pituitary gland that controls hormone production. The jousting accident in 1536 did not just destroy Henry's legs. It destroyed his mind. Slowly. Progressively. Irreversibly. Henry became convinced that God hated him. That his inability to produce healthy male heirs was divine punishment. That his rotting legs were marks of sin. He would spend hours in his private chapel, praying desperately, begging for mercy from a God he increasingly believed had abandoned him. His religious faith, once confident and defiant, curdled into terrified superstition. He wore blessed amulets. He paid for masses to be said continuously. He consulted astrologers and mystics seeking reassurance that was never forthcoming. The psychological torture matched the physical. Chronic pain rewires the brain. Constant agony makes paranoia rational. When your body is attacking itself, when every moment brings suffering, trust becomes impossible. Henry lived in permanent crisis mode. Fight or flight responses, firing constantly with nowhere to run and nothing to fight except his own failing flesh. By 1543, when he married Catherine Parr, the vibrant intellectual who had captivated Europe's courts was gone, replaced by a bloated, paranoid, pain-ravaged tyrant whose mind was as broken as his body. No woman could have navigated intimacy with this psychological minefield. The physical impossibility of romance was almost secondary to the mental impossibility of connecting with whatever Henry had become. Catherine Parr did not want to marry Henry VIII. She made that clear in letters she would write later. When Lord Latimer, her second husband, died in March 1543, Catherine finally had freedom. At 31 years old, twice widowed, she had wealth, independence, and most importantly, she had Thomas Seymour, the king's dashing brother-in-law, a man her own age who made her laugh, a man whose body did not announce death from 3 rooms away. They were planning a future together. Catherine and Thomas. Secret meetings. Whispered promises. For the first time in her life, she could choose love over duty. Then Henry noticed her. The king was 52 years old, 300 pounds, unable to walk without being carried by 6 men. His legs rotted inside perpetual bandages. His mind fractured by pain and paranoia. He had executed his previous wife barely 16 months earlier. This was the man who decided Catherine would be his next queen. This was not a proposal. It was a command disguised in courtly language. Catherine's family pressured her immediately. Her brother reminded her that one does not refuse a king. Her uncle explained the honors and wealth that would flow to their entire bloodline. But Catherine knew what had happened to the previous 5 wives. Divorced, executed, dead in childbirth, divorced again, executed again. The survival rate was not encouraging. So why did she accept? Thomas Seymour was shipped off to Brussels within days of Henry's interest becoming known. A diplomatic posting that removed him from court. From Catherine, the message was clear. Refuse the king, and the man you love faces consequences. Accept, and perhaps Thomas survives to see another day. But there was something else. Something Catherine's religious writings reveal. She believed this was God's will, that she was being called to serve a higher purpose, not as a wife in any traditional sense, but as a caretaker, as someone who could manage the final years of a dying tyrant, and perhaps, just perhaps, protect his children. Mary and Elizabeth, both declared illegitimate, both living in dangerous uncertainty. Catherine saw them, saw their need for an advocate, for a stepmother who actually cared whether they survived their father's paranoia. On July 12, 1543, Catherine Parr married Henry VIII in the Queen's Closet at Hampton Court Palace. It was a small ceremony, almost private. Henry's daughters Mary and Elizabeth attended, watching this brave woman commit to an impossible task. Catherine chose as her motto, "To be useful in all I do." Not to love or to honor, but to be useful. The language of nursing, of duty, of grim determination. The wedding night reality must have been horrifying. No romantic consummation. Just the practical assessment of how to manage a husband who could not walk, could not control his bladder reliably, whose legs needed dressing changes multiple times daily, whose mood could turn homicidal without warning. Catherine was not becoming a wife. She was becoming a combination of nurse, manager, bodyguard, and hostage. This was survival, nothing more. And everyone, including Henry, knew it. The wedding night was a formality that never happened. Not in any meaningful sense. Catherine Parr's sleeping arrangements at Hampton Court tell the story more clearly than any chronicle. She was given chambers adjacent to the king's apartments, connected by a door. But that door remained closed most nights. Not by choice or propriety, by physical necessity. Henry could not perform his marital duties. The evidence is everywhere, once you know where to look. No pregnancies. Catherine had been married twice before with no children, but she was only 31 years old, still well within childbearing years. Yet in 3.5 years of marriage to Henry, nothing. not a miscarriage, not even a pregnancy scare. Complete silence on the subject that had consumed Henry's entire reign. The desperate need for more sons. Suddenly, with Catherine, that obsession vanished. Because it was impossible. Try to imagine the mechanics. Henry weighed over 300 pounds. He could not support his own weight while standing. Could not walk without 6 men carrying him. Could not kneel. Could not roll over in bed without assistance. His legs were wrapped in bandages that stank of decay and needed changing multiple times daily. Any pressure on those legs caused screaming agony. Any movement triggered the infected ulcers to weep and bleed. The pain was constant and all-consuming. Modern pain scales go from 1 to 10. Henry lived at 11. Every moment. The only relief came from wine and poppy-derived drugs that left him either unconscious or too intoxicated to function. The idea of romantic intimacy in that state was grotesque, physically impossible, medically dangerous. Catherine's role was nurse, not lover. She managed his medications. She coordinated with physicians. She supervised the servants who changed his bandages and cleaned the perpetual mess his body produced. She read to him when the pain was manageable enough for him to focus. She prayed with him when his paranoia convinced him that God's punishment was imminent. This was her daily reality. There was no room in it for intimacy. The court knew. Everyone knew. The gossiping stopped not because Catherine and Henry were a loving couple, but because there was nothing to gossip about. No pregnancy watches. No speculation about royal mistresses. No whispers about the king's affections wandering. Henry's sexuality, which had driven 3 decades of political chaos, religious reformation, and judicial murder, had simply ceased to exist. Historians debate whether Henry's impotence was psychological or purely physical. The answer is both. The leg ulcers and obesity made mechanics impossible. The brain damage from the jousting accident destroyed hormone regulation. The chronic pain rewired his nervous system. The psychological trauma of watching his body betray him killed whatever desire remained. By 1543, Henry was functionally neutered. Not by choice, not by age alone. By accumulated catastrophic damage to every system that makes intimacy possible. Catherine Parr was Henry's wife in name and legal status, but she was his nurse in reality, his caretaker, his manager. She performed every duty of a queen, except the one that Henry had murdered 2 previous wives for failing to perform adequately. And the cruel irony is that Catherine survived precisely because Henry could no longer make those demands. The impossibility of intimacy saved her life. Catherine Parr's wedding gift to herself was a set of accounting ledgers. Not jewelry, not gowns, ledgers. Because managing Henry VIII in his final years required the organizational skills of a military quartermaster. Every detail of his declining body had to be tracked, measured, and controlled, or chaos would consume them both. 1544. Henry's eyesight began failing. Not gradually. Suddenly. One morning he could read correspondence. The next, the letters swam and blurred into meaningless shapes. Catherine arranged for spectacles to be imported from Venice, where craftsmen produced the finest lenses in Europe. Henry needed stronger magnification every few months. The royal accounts show purchases of reading glasses in bulk. 10 pairs at a time. 20 pairs. Not because of breakage, but because his vision deteriorated so rapidly that each set became useless within weeks. Documents piled up unsigned. State business ground to a halt because the king could no longer see well enough to put quill to parchment. When he did attempt signatures, his hand shook so violently that the results were illegible. A mechanical stamp was created with Henry's signature. For the first time in English history, the king's personal approval became a piece of stamped metal rather than his living hand. Nobody discussed the implications. That the king was being replaced by a tool. That power was slipping from his grasp literally and figuratively. The hunting trips stopped entirely by 1545. The king who had once ridden from dawn to dusk, who had personally killed deer and boar and hawks, now sat in gardens while servants brought him caged birds. He would watch them through failing eyes, remembering what it felt like to move to chase, to conquer. The memories must have been torture worse than his legs. Catherine managed everything. His medications, administered on strict schedules. His diet, carefully controlled, though Henry frequently raged and demanded more food than his body could process. His temper, deflected and redirected when possible, endured when not. His religious paranoia, gently guided toward prayers rather than purges. She walked a tightrope daily, knowing that one misstep, one theological argument too forcefully made, could see her join the previous 2 executed queens. In 1546, Henry began having trouble speaking. Words would catch in his throat, slur together, disappear mid-sentence while his mouth kept moving silently. The brain damage from the jousting accident, combined with possible small strokes from his obesity and infections, was destroying his ability to communicate. The man who had once debated theology with Europe's greatest minds could barely finish a coherent sentence. By late 1546, Henry spent most days unconscious or semi-conscious. The drugs required to manage his pain kept him in a twilight state. Catherine would sit with him, reading scriptures, holding his swollen hand, performing the duties of a wife while feeling nothing but grim determination to survive. She had watched him decline from mobile to wheelchair, bound to bedridden in less than 4 years. Now she was watching him die, one organ system at a time. The man who had terrorized England for 38 years had been reduced to a breathing corpse, still dangerous, still king, but no longer remotely human in any way that mattered. January 28th, 1547. Whitehall Palace. 2 hours before midnight. Henry VIII lay dying in his privy chamber, and even in death his body refused him mercy. The leg ulcers that had tormented him for 11 years had reached their final stage. Not healing, not stabilizing, spreading. His physicians performed one last desperate cauterization 3 days earlier. Heating the irons, burning the rotting flesh, trying to halt the inevitable. Henry's screams were weaker than before, his voice nearly gone. The pain was the same. His capacity to express it had simply run out. After the procedure, he slipped into semi-consciousness and never fully emerged. The infection had won. Blood poisoning flooded his system. His kidneys, overwhelmed by toxins from the perpetual infections, began shutting down. His liver, destroyed by years of excessive drinking to numb the pain, stopped filtering properly. His heart, straining to pump blood through 300 pounds of dying tissue, was failing. His brain, damaged 11 years ago and never recovered, was shutting down like a candle running out of wax. Catherine Parr sat beside him. Not from love, from duty, from the grim determination that had kept her alive through 3.5 years of nursing this monster. She held his hand. The fingers were cold. The pulse was weak and irregular. She prayed, not for his recovery. That was beyond even God now, for his soul, for peace, for an end to suffering that had consumed too many years and too many lives. Henry could not speak. His eyes opened occasionally, seeing nothing, recognizing no one. The man who had commanded kingdoms, who had broken with Rome, who had married 6 times and executed 2 wives, was reduced to shallow breathing and involuntary muscle twitches. At 55 years old, he looked 80. A grotesque ruin of the Golden Prince who had once been Europe's most desired bachelor. Just before 2 in the morning, his breathing changed. The death rattle. Catherine had heard it twice before with her previous husbands. She knew what it meant. She squeezed his hand. Whether he felt it, no one knows. His chest rose one final time, held, then collapsed. Henry VIII was dead. The king who had spent 30 years pursuing women with obsessive hunger had died without a mistress, without intimacy, without touch beyond medical necessity. The body that had betrayed him so completely finally released him. And in that moment, Catherine Parr became the first of Henry's wives to survive him. So that is why Henry VIII had no mistresses after Catherine Howard's execution. Not grief, not guilt, not religious conversion. His body had become so grotesque, so diseased, so physically repulsive that intimacy was impossible. The wolf had been reduced to carrion before death even claimed him. This is the history they sanitize in textbooks. The comfortable lies about a troubled king who made difficult choices. But the truth is so much darker, so much more human. Henry did not die a monster despite his body. His body made him a monster. Pain and decay and disability transformed him from man to nightmare. If this video opened your eyes to the reality they hide, if you want more dark history that refuses to look away from the ugliest truths, then subscribe right now. Because there are hundreds of stories like this. Royal scandals so disturbing they have been buried for centuries. And I am going to uncover every single one. Hit that subscribe button. Join me in dragging history's darkest secrets into the light. Because the past was not pretty. And we owe it to the people who lived through these horrors to remember what really happened. Not the fairy tale. The truth. Subscribe. Let us discover it together.